Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Ditcham, and welcome to this session, the webinar on organised crime in North Korea. Before we start, just a couple of things to mention. Firstly, just to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. I'd like to thank the Uni Korea Foundation for helping organise and sponsor this event, as well as my colleagues within RUSI. And I'd also like to thank our two panel members, who I'll introduce shortly, for agreeing to talk at this event. The other thing I'd like to just point out as well is at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function, the question and answer function. Please, if you have questions, post your questions in there. I will be monitoring that throughout the process, and hope that we'll be able to have a very lively discussion in relation to the events, the subject of this interesting webinar today. Just to introduce myself a little bit, so I'm currently the Acting Director of the Organised Crime and Policing Research Group at RUSI, and I've been in RUSI for a little over 2.5 years. Prior to that, I spent most of my career working for the National Criminal Intelligence Service, what then became the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and then the National Crime Agency as an international liaison officer or manager of international liaison officers as well, largely working in Europe and Latin America. So North Korea is an interesting area for myself. I believe I have a reasonable understanding of organised crime, but that is no need to be complacent. And I'm very interested to hear what our two speakers have to say in relation to organised crime in the country, and also how organised crime there affects global events as well. North Korea, some of you may have heard or read, is described as a soprano state, and having recently caught up with the Sopranos, I'm very interested to hear what our speakers may think about that description. So if I could just introduce our two speakers. They're going to talk for each for about 5 to 7 minutes in order to set out their knowledge and set out the webinar in context as well, before we then move to the question and answer session. So our first speaker today will be Ethan Jewell, who is a Seoul-based correspondent for NK News. He focuses on sanctions, trade and maritime issues, and he's previously worked as investigations and intelligence specialist for Pinkerton Comprehensive Risk Management, and also as a research intern for the Brookings Institution's Centre for East Asia Policy Studies. And his remarks will focus on North Korea's criminal activity overseas and the challenges these networks create. Our second speaker today is Dr. John Park, who's director of the Korea Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Dr. Park's core research project focus on the political economy of the Korean Peninsula, nuclear proliferation, economic statecraft, Asian trade negotiations, and North Korea's cyber activities. He has a very interesting and varied CV, and I'll just pick out a few other things as well. He's a commentator on Asian geopolitical issues on CNN, the BBC, CNBC, Fox Business, Fox News, and Bloomberg TV. And he also advises institutional investors on geopolitical risk in Asia-Pacific markets. His current research focuses on the North Korea regime's accumulated learning in evading sanctions. Dr. Park received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he completed his pre-doctoral and postdoctoral training at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. He has testified in North Korea before the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee as well. So I'd like to extend my personal thanks, but also thanks of Lucy as well, to our two esteemed panelists today. So if I could come to you first, Ethan, please, to spend about 5 to 7 minutes talking about your knowledge of organised crime in North Korea. If you start to run over, I may raise my hand and interrupt you, but so just look out for that. But interested to hear what you have to say. Over to you, Ethan.
Great. Thanks, Keith, and hello to everyone. I'm currently in United States, so it's early in the morning here. But first, I just wanted to say thank you to Rusi for organizing this event and for the opportunity to speak with y'all today. So a large part of my job as data correspondent at NK News has involved tracking North Korea's maritime activity specifically. And a large part of that activity, as it turns out, is illicit in one way or another. Now, everyone's already well aware of North Korea's oil and coal smuggling efforts in international waters and the complex criminal networks that are behind those networks. So instead of rehashing that, I wanted to talk about an emerging technology that I think could change the way that nations monitor illicit activity at sea, thus targeting the actual manifestations of what North Korea's transnational crime networks exist to facilitate. So the first thing to note is that virtually all of the information we have about maritime activity on the high seas comes from what's known as the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. And AIS is essentially a radio-based geolocation system. Nearly every ship is required by international convention to be equipped with an AIS transponder, which allows ships to safely navigate and avoid collisions, especially in crowded ports. But needless to say, criminals aren't all that interested in broadcasting their locations. So those seeking to evade the eyes of international sanctions monitors have a very easy solution, and that's to simply turn off one's AIS transponder. This is the easiest way to evade detection, but there are, of course, more complex methods of laundering a ship's identity, broadcasting fraudulent identifiers, and so on. At the end of the day, though, the biggest weakness of this system is that it requires participation. And although there do exist incentives for almost everyone to use AIS to safely navigate, there's no requirement in the absolute sense to force ships to use it. Now, late last year, an organization called Global Fishing Watch announced a machine learning competition called XView 3. And put simply, contestants in XView 3 were tasked with creating a machine learning algorithm capable of spotting ships in what's known as synthetic aperture radar data, or SAR. And instead of using, say, visible light from satellites we're used to seeing, SAR makes use of radar imagery. So long wavelength radio signals can pierce through things like clouds and even dense forest canopies. And it also doesn't need daylight to work, which means that things like nighttime ship-to-ship transfers are no longer effective for circumnavigating sanctions. The problem is that there's simply too much of this data to go through to keep tabs on these networks. Each photo is something like 100 million pixels, and each of those pixels represents 10 square meters on the surface of the water. In other words, it's almost impossible for any human analyst to make sense of this SAR data. So what the XView 3 challenge that Global Fishing Watch sponsored did was ask contestants to make sense of this literal sea of data. And as it turned out, a Ukrainian machine learning engineer known as Eugene came up with a solution that was able to detect ship-to-ship transfers between 20-meter-long fishing boats with a really high degree of accuracy. When I asked Eugene if it would be possible to extend this technology or this detection methodology to, say, ship-to-ship transfers of oil out in international waters, he said he didn't see why it couldn't. He also said it's able to categorize vessels, and the technology only gets better as the algorithm processes more and more imagery. So as of now, this is only being used by Global Fishing Watch to detect illegal fishing, another one of North Korea's transnational criminal enterprises. But one of the conditions of this XView 3 competition was that the winning solution must be open source, and it is. So Eugene's solution is freely available right now, and any government with an interest in helping tamp down on illicit North Korean activity on the high seas is welcome to use it. And employing this technology would free up a lot of manpower to focus on other analytical tasks. So right now, organizations such as RUSI and the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, or C4ADS, have to spend significant manpower making sense of incomplete and sometimes falsified AIS data to string together this series of events that led to just a single ship-to-ship transfer. And putting together these events is crucial for building cases against the criminal enterprises that support North Korea's oil smuggling efforts. But with the ability to interpret SAR imagery, analysts could basically efficiently task expensive high-resolution images, saving both time and money. So right now, though, overall North Korean maritime activity is down, which means that most of there are still, criminal enterprises and criminal networks active overseas, but there has been a slowdown overall due to North Korea's self-imposed COVID-19 border closures. This means that both oil and coal flows have been somewhat hamstrung by lengthy waits outside of Nampo port, for instance. But this won't last forever, and eventually the North Korean regime will employ its overseas criminal networks to more normal levels. The trick is to use the right tools to catch them. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Sorry, just on it. That's it. Got my video working again. Thanks very much for your comments there. Can I just remind participants, please, to, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A function that's available, and we'll get to your questions shortly. Dr. John Park, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll hand the microphone over to you now.
Thanks so much, Keith. Thanks to you and the RUSI team for having me today. Building on what Ethan has mentioned, I wanted to look also at the space where North Korea has, in a very documented fashion, accumulated more through cryptocurrency thefts. I think when you see that fact pattern and very interesting analysis of blockchain when it comes to these type of incidents, there are more and more groups out there, in particular Chainalysis, and how they've done very sophisticated analysis of the blockchain in tracking these activities. So what I wanted to bring to the audience's attention today is looking at the macro shock right now of the decline of cryptocurrencies. In some instances, we're seeing a 50% decline. So the question here, how does it affect North Korea Incorporated, the collection of elite North Korean state trading companies engaged in illicit activities, very much in the transnational flavor and characteristics here? So with this, my colleague at the Harvard Kennedy School, Alex O'Neill, recently came out with a study looking at the relationship between North Korean cyber actors and Russian-speaking criminal organizations. The title of his report, Cyber Criminal Statecraft, something that he's coined, is a phenomenon that is growing. And with this type of activity, before you saw the North Korean regime generate alternative, sustained, recurring revenue streams that in some instances were very concerning in terms of how they could compensate for areas where sanctions were making progress, putting a dent in illicit revenue generation and sources and whatnot. I think there are three important points related to this phenomenon right now, and I'd like to bring that to the attention of the audience. Number one is, when you look at this lucrative cyber criminal statecraft as a tool, clearly it was highly effective. And as a result, North Korea Incorporated benefited in terms of having access to more resources. The question now, as we see the value of the cryptocurrency that they have stolen decline, how are they going to generate revenue from other sources? To give you a little bit of context to that, we've seen in some of the studies that of an amount of cryptocurrency equivalent that the North Koreans have stolen, when you look at all of the different processes they have to go through in order to convert to fiat, by the end of it, the actual hard currency they have is anywhere from 10 to 15% of the amount of the cryptocurrency they stole. So it's modest gains in terms of this broader picture. And now you have to calculate that that particular fiat currency amount is halved because of the broader decline now. So the question of where the North Korean regime will go to essentially generate additional revenue to compensate for these downfalls, I think is an important one to investigate further. And as Ethan mentioned, with coal smuggling and other activities, this is something that has been durable of sorts, but we have seen the tremendous amounts of cryptocurrency equivalents that the North Koreans have been able to get. And so even with modest increase of coal smuggling, the gap is still going to be pretty dramatic. The second point is, when you look at it from the perspective, the research that we conducted, my colleague Jim Walsh at MIT and I looked at the partners, the practices and the pathways of North Korea Incorporated. The outside shocks to the North Korean regime, in this instance by way of more sophisticated targeted sanctions, we saw the spark in terms of innovation, new ways of doing business. The North Korean regime was in many respects forced to discover and develop new partnerships. And in doing that, they essentially developed more sophisticated ways of doing this type of sanctions evasion. In the current space, with North Korea Incorporated trying to weather this crypto storm, analogous to the sanctions storm earlier, with the increasing onslaught of more sophisticated sanctions, adaptation, and then the evolution of pretty sophisticated evasion mechanisms here. The current question is, what will this cryptocurrency storm now spark in terms of innovation for this current round? Going into the future here, who will be the new partners? What will be the new opportunities that the North Korean regime will be forced to make? The third and final point before opening up to Q&A is looking at it from the perspective of sources and uses. With the recurring source of revenue here from the cryptocurrency theft being disrupted because of this broad contextual decline in the cryptocurrency space, the question here is, what cuts will the North Korean regime make in order to essentially do more with less, as they are able to get less fiat through this downturn? How are they going to deal with this particular dilemma? I think that is a question that we have to monitor very carefully as best we can. But the initial question is actually more dire. We've seen patterns in the past where these type of shocks have led the regime to look inside of North Korea and figure out ways where they can expropriate, some cases squeeze internal groups in terms of almost like a shakedown to try to compensate for these emptying coffers. And so here, already in a very difficult situation, as Ethan mentioned, North Korea has been in the self-imposed quarantine since January 2020. It's become all the more stringent with their reported announcement of the outbreak of COVID in the country as well. You're going to basically see meager pickings internally as well. So aspects of the Tonju, some of the state trading company activities that had been starting up very modestly, but now have been shut down again. So the question here, again, what will happen in terms of some of these domestic opportunities as a regime sees it in order to fill some of these emptying coffers. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your comments there, especially around. Sorry, I seem to turn my video off, on and off, around the cryptocurrency, which has generated some questions, which is good. So if I can stay with you, John, just for a moment, please. So the question from Julian Koch is it known if North Korea sells her know-how in cyber criminality to other states or organized crime outfits?
Sure, I highly recommend my colleague Alex O'Neill's report and of his study with the partnerships between the North Korean cyber actors and Russian-speaking criminal organizations. Rather than selling that type of technology or that type of know-how and those techniques, there are these partnerships. They're commercially driven, very lucrative partnerships that have been increasing over time. And so I think that's the angle where these type of relationships I think, if we start tracking it from after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the application of very stringent sanctions on Russia, there are anecdotal pieces where on different message boards, the Russian-speaking actors here in the cyber domain were basically complaining about not being paid and so forth. So I think those type of business opportunities, and that's what they are, and to the heart of the question and the answer there, these business opportunities are going to increase. But again, this is before the recent downturn, and a very dramatic one in the cryptocurrency markets. And so how the North Korean cyber actors here are going to navigate that and how they might get a bit of relief in terms of maybe more innovative, different types of exploits in the space. I think that's a space we'll be monitoring very closely and watching.
Excellent, thank you very much. There are some other questions around crypto, but I'm conscious that Ethan is here as well. So I'll pose this question to Ethan initially, but again, John, if you have anything to add, please do after Ethan has answered it. But so the question, and it is something that you mentioned, John, yourself, about the outbreak of COVID. So Ian MacDonald has asked, will the outbreak of COVID in North Korea lead to an increase in criminal activity? If I could come to you first, Ethan, please.
Will the outbreak of COVID-19 within North Korea lead to increased criminal activity? Is that the question?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to see how that might have any solid bearing on what the overseas criminal networks are doing. As far as Pyongyang is concerned, it's able to continue testing record levels, record numbers of missiles, several intercontinental ballistic missiles. We know now that they've been preparing for some time for a nuclear test. All the while, they've had one of the worst the only known COVID-19 outbreak in the country that has hit, upwards of 4 to 5 million people, and most likely many more. It's hard to see how that might have any bearing on what the overseas networks are doing, especially since the regime has its needs, has its demands, and as long as the countries that the operatives essentially are working in, now in China, I could see how an outbreak in China might impact the ability for, say, front companies in Hong Kong or Singapore to conduct their business. I could see how that would disrupt the overseas networks, but it's hard to see how an outbreak in North Korea would have any bearing on them.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. John, anything from yourself in addition to what Ethan has said?
Sure, very briefly, I think with that, the COVID challenge right now is really an analysis of government policies. We've seen this clearly with North Korea. They've been consistent. January of 2020, they've implemented the self-quarantine. There's been some easing. There was some freight train traffic earlier this year, but once the outbreak in China and the clampdowns and the shutdowns of cities in China started to roll out, you saw the border essentially being sealed on the Chinese side. And now with concern from Chinese authorities of potentially different variants, also COVID spreading in from North Korea into the Chinese provinces, I think we're going to see more of these type of stringent closures, which raise two important points. I think one is, even in instances where the North Korean regime is able, through illicit activities, procure items that they want to bring back to North Korea, because of the COVID concern, I think it's going to be increasingly held delays at the border and things along those lines. And also, when it comes to the whole point of the cryptocurrency piece of it, I think this is another element where, if you do look at the increasing severity of the COVID challenge for the North Koreans, their enhanced capabilities in cryptocurrency theft operations, their advancements in their WMD programs, none of these activities actually have a material impact in addressing the COVID challenge. So this is a period where I think we have to view it through the lens of the Kim Jong-un leadership dealing with some very serious leadership challenges. And as these crises continue to compound one after the other, I do think there will be an effort to investigate and try to do more illicit activities. But the first order of business will be looking internally. And so, to my earlier point, I think they're going to look for ways to squeeze internal sources. But at this stage, after 2 years of the self-imposed quarantine, how much is left?
Excellent. Thank you very much for your answer. Ethan, I'm going to come to you next, if I may, because you concentrated on your presentation and your comments around AIS and the SAR system for ships. There's a question here from Dick Rogers, who asks whether transshipping coal on the high seas is a tricky or time-consuming activity. I suspect it's probably both, but Ethan, I'll ask you to answer that one if you would, please. And by all means, John, if you have anything to add, do come in afterwards.
Well, I guess it'd be tricky if it was your first time doing it, but North Korea's been doing this ever since, coal was sanctioned, I believe, absolutely in 2017. I could be wrong on the exact year, but it's been several years, and we saw transshipment of coal and whatnot on the high seas actually increase all the way up until COVID hit. And at that point, the North Korea's interactions with the outside world decreased markedly. But I wouldn't say it's particularly tricky because ship-to-ship transfers on the high seas are not a phenomenon unique to North Korea. It's very common shipping practice, and it's completely legal for countries to do it because it's most of the time it's an economical way to do business. So it's not particularly tricky in that sense, although North Korea has had to employ a little bit unorthodox methods to make it harder to be detected. So conducting those transfers at night, or using barges essentially that are not meant to sail internationally to actually move from, say, near North Korea's Sinŭiju on its northwest corner to Dandong right across the border. So essentially they're using barges that are too small, that really too small for the task they've been assigned to do, that are not required to have AIS transponders on them because they are exempted under international maritime conventions. So there are like some oddities and extra little tricks they have to go through to make it happen, but I wouldn't say that it's particularly a high bar to jump over for the North Koreans.
Okay, thank you very much. John, anything you'd like to add to that or not? No, okay, thank you. Let's return then, John, if we may, to cryptocurrency. This one is from someone who has chosen to remain anonymous, but interesting question here, asking whether we should expect to see North Korean cyber actors pivoting away from targeting crypto exchanges, asking for ransomware payments in crypto, and back to targeting fiat currency directly, i.e. through functions such as SWIFT?
That's a great question. And I think that is an area to monitor and stay alert on, because that, to me, reduces some of these obstacles and these challenges that the North Korean regime is dealing with because of this cryptocurrency crash. And it doesn't look like it's over. This is something that is system-wide. The context picture here is important. There was fidelity in this idea that as you see inflation, as you see the Federal Reserve, other governments trying to respond with increasing interest rates, stock markets being affected, stocks going down, crypto would somehow be immune to this. And so what we're seeing right now is essentially a reevaluation of a firmly held belief that was system-wide. And so this is a trend that's likely to continue. And with that, going back to focusing and prioritizing, going after fiat, I think is something that is going to be a desperation play. The point I mentioned about going after fiat is that there are now increasing techniques for monitoring these type of activities on the North Korean side. So it's almost as if after each of these exploits, these cases, these instances, there's learning going on from the side of different types of companies that have been monitoring this activity very closely, also from governments as they beef up and they try to raise more awareness for those within their jurisdiction. So there is this iterative game that as North Korea in the past have had these exploits, this time around, they're going to be confronting enhanced capabilities. We'll see how effective they are, but that is something that I believe we have to brace for.
Thank you very much. Ethan, anything to add to that or not? No, okay, thank you. A question from myself. We've talked a lot about cryptocurrency and some of the bunkering activity, sanctions busting activity, shall we say? But North Korea is known as well for its production and distribution of drugs such as heroin and methamphetamine, for its counterfeit activity around currency, particularly US dollars, cigarettes, pharmaceuticals as well. It's smuggling sanctioned items that relate to environmental crime, money laundering, and then some of the weapons smuggling and trading in weapons of mass destruction as well, some of which we've touched on. But it's a question of both of you. Do you have a feel for how much, what sort of proportion of activity is it because of the environment very difficult to actually put a figure on that? And it relates to a question that I've also received from Julian Koch, who talks about how much of North Korean organized crime is not directly related to the state. So I'd be interested in sort of your answer in relation to sort of state-sponsored organized criminality along some of those themes that I've just mentioned, and then what parts you believe are not, if in fact there are any. I'll come to you, John, first, if I may.
Sure, whether it's directly related to state organizations or indirectly, there is, I think, the challenge of always coming up with what credible range is in terms of these activities generating revenue for the regime. But yeah, I think the fundamental point here is even if you see instances where the North Korean regime is making money off of these illicit activities, whatever they use, those funds to procure, getting those items into North Korea right now are blocked at the border. And so this is a a type of phenomenon where there's no clear indication of a timetable for easing up of the borders. It looks like right now, the storm that's raging within North Korea on the COVID side leads to a prolonged, stringent closure of the border. So I think it's less about the revenue generation and what the regime uses that either directly or indirectly to procure, try to bring items back to North Korea, but it's this almost hermetic seal that the regime has placed around the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Ethan, anything from yourself in relation to that question?
So if I understood the question correctly, it was two parts. What amount of how much money essentially does the North Korea's organized crime abroad put together for the regime, and what degree of what amount of it is state sponsored and not state sponsored? Just touching more on the second one, because I think it's difficult to come up with it's North Korea, so we can't even trust official trade statistics, let alone broadcasts from their ships. I think trying to put a dollar amount on how much the regime's overseas activities put together is just, we would require access to information that I don't think we'll see for a very, very long time until the archives are essentially cracked open. But on the second one, as far as I'm aware, most of the regime's overseas activities are directed by the state, and it goes down to even some of the more benign or innocuous activities. So just to take one example off the top of my head, I know you named things such as methamphetamine and heroin. Well, that's pretty hardcore. It's a lot more compared to, say, selling fishing rights in North Korean waters. And we were doing some work into that not too long ago, and found that a lot of the network in China that actually sells fishing rights in North Korean waters, which is a sanctioned activity and thus criminal, it's actually linked deeply to Chinese organized crime as well. But those who are close to that network have said that there's essentially a liaison between those groups and Pyongyang. And so you sort of have this mafia boss orders coming down from the top type of relationship, and that funnels down into the local level where the gangs essentially make it happen. So a lot of it is directed by the state, and just as much of North Korea's domestic affairs is all oriented towards serving the center.
Okay, thank you both for your answer to those two-part question, as you say. A question from Gary: what impact do you think the sanctions against Russia will have on North Korea's ability to illicitly generate revenue and procure goods from overseas? If I could come to you first, John, please.
Sure. Gary highlights a fast-moving phenomenon right now. The sanctions that the U.S. government and U.S.-led efforts against Russia are quite breathtaking in terms of their scope. Whole segments, whole sectors of the Russian economy have essentially been decoupled from the global economy. And so from that, one of the interesting things, and this is, I think, an unintended consequence, but something that the US side is increasing more, as colleagues in Washington have been observing, the US government, particularly the Treasury Department, are invoking the authorities under these Russia-focused sanctions to look at connections with North Korean entities. So it's almost like beefing up in terms of already some comprehensive and very stringent sanctions focused on North Korea. But the Russia angle to this leads to new designations, and we've seen that very recently. The second thing I'd highlight is, from a slightly different angle, if you look at it, the Russian entities that are now trying to navigate these sanctions, if you look at their predicament, there is a parallel to where the North Korean regime was with the onslaught of some of the more stringent sanctions, the targeted sanctions after ICBM tests and nuclear tests a few years ago. And so when you look at it from that aspect of learning from some other actors doing, there are, I think, opportunities for the North Korean example to be an opportunity of learning for the Russians as they're trying to figure out how to get around some of these measures and restrictions.
Thank you. Ethan, anything to add?
Just one small thing to add to that. I've heard from people who are more knowledgeable on Russia than I am that there's some strain of thinking that the sort of overwhelming Western response in terms of sanctions towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to push Russia further and further from anything resembling like a liberal international world order or something like that, and thus make the Russian state more a little bit more flexible on helping North Korea here or there, whereas before they wanted to appear as a more responsible player in this international order. And so there's some fear that Russia being overwhelmingly sanctioned could sort of alienate it from the international community and thus push it to actually aid and abet essentially North Korea's illicit profit generating operations. So small possibility there, but just something to add.
Yeah, okay, thank you both for your answer to that. So another question here about the future trends and direction of North Korean organised crime. John, if I come to you first, what do you think the next 5 years, shall we say, holds for the shape and nature of organised crime emanating from the DPRK?
The current downturn in cryptocurrencies is something that is devastating. It is something that was unexpected, and it's happening at a level that caught many by surprise. However, the 5-year trend line for cryptocurrencies, given the large number of diverse actors that have come into this marketplace, it looks like there will be a rebound. It's just a question of when the rebound will happen. So related to this question, I do see North Korea in this space becoming more active in terms of cryptocurrency theft, because as you see the different types of virtual assets, and a project that I'm doing with the RUSI team as well, with Aaron Arnold and Allison, you're looking at a situation where the growth of virtual assets in places like South Korea necessitate the greater use of cryptocurrency wallets and cryptocurrency services and exchanges. And so with that rebound, I think we'll see North Korea continue with those activities where those cryptocurrency wallets are going to be increasing targets for them. So this is a downturn. It is, to me though, the question of how the North Koreans weather this. If you look at some of the more diversified holders of assets where cryptocurrency is just one asset class, and granted it's a very unique one, they can try to weather the storm and not dump their cryptocurrencies and wait for the rebound. I don't think North Korea is in this position where they can hold on to it, sit on it and wait. I think that we're going to try and find ways to convert it to fiat as best they can out of desperation. But this 5-year period, I do see North Korea essentially trying to siphon more from this growing activity as we are likely to see a rebound in this space.
Thank you, John. Ethan.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of echoing, I suppose, what John was saying. It's hard for me to imagine that the more traditional side of the country's organized crime, such as its overseas networks in Hong Kong and whatnot, are going to be nearly as important as its cyber activities. So, as John mentioned earlier, I think the country's crypto theft activities have been extraordinary in recent years, and it's probably a much better investment of time, effort, and money to have just a few people gain these high techs, gain these extraordinary skill set, and then orchestrate, say, a $500 million attack on Axie Infinity, which happened earlier this year. Then go through all of the trouble of trying to set up these organized crime networks abroad, selling meth wherever. It's just much easier, much simpler, and much more elegant, I guess, solution to move your activities into cyberspace in that sense. So I do see that area becoming much more important in the next 5 years or so.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just a reminder to our participants, if you do have questions, we've got just under 20 minutes left of this webinar, so please do post your question. There's a burning question that you have around North Korea, and you could not be in better company to have that answered by either John or Ethan today. And remember, there's no such thing as a silly question, so please do pose your questions. A question here from Eduardo. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Eduardo. Is North Korea using fiscal havens effectively to facilitate illegal economic activities? Would either John or Ethan like to answer that question?
I'll take a first swing at that. What we're seeing in many respects is North Korean regime, and through this elite group of state trading companies, North Korea Incorporated, there are practices that are very similar to a global phenomenon called family offices. This is where you see a concentration of wealth. It's usually intergenerational families that command, assets that essentially move markets. In many instances, the family office is a single family office, and you get a sense of assets in the hundreds of billions of dollars. When some of these family offices combine, the purchasing power and their weight in certain sectors merit further investigation. So this is already a global phenomenon. The services, the financial services, the different types of tax havens, efficient structures and things along those lines, very optimized. And so in many respects, I think we already saw some of the migration of North Korean corporate activities to family office-like functions. They're set up globally, but I think some of the more advanced, sophisticated ones are based out of Singapore. When you look at it from ultra high net worth individuals in the United States in particular, and these are the tech billionaires, they're increasingly setting up their family offices in Singapore. It's just a very convenient global platform. And so to Eduardo's question, this is something where the opportunity to get into this financial services, very bespoke, global reach, it is something that is fairly straightforward. And I do think when you see some of the growth of North Korean activities in these marketplaces, the early days of a quick business trip turning into North Korean diplomats living in these countries and trying to break into these markets and these networks, and now individuals on the North Korean sides who are deployed and who are members of these local communities. I do think we're seeing some of these patterns where we're going to see more of North Korea Inc. type of entities within this broader global phenomenon of single family offices.
Thank you, John. Ethan? No? Okay, fine. Thanks very much. Another question from Gary, concentrating on crypto activities again. So he asks, as North Korea becomes more active in generating revenue from crypto activities, do you think there'll be an increase in cooperation between the regime and organized crime groups in this space? John, I'll come to you, if I may, first.
Sure, I do think so. And it's a very lucrative partnership where the lessons learned and the networks and connections of each side and what they bring to the table can lead to efficient, essential next steps after they steal a cryptocurrency. The bottleneck remains converting cryptocurrency to fiat. And I think with that, you're seeing some industry focus. So within the broader space, as I mentioned earlier with digital assets, there is a subset of that marketplace that's trying to make it easier, remove the friction for this is legal and essentially trying to get more consumers in the growth of digital asset type of marketplaces, but make it essentially frictionless to convert cryptocurrency into fiat. So as that is already ongoing, this is an area where advancements in this particular sector could have benefits, unintended positive benefits for North Korean cyber actors, and in many cases, a Russian-speaking criminal partners here. A couple of quick things to add. One is when you do look at the whole crypto space and ransomware and rackets, this is, I think, still at a hypothesis stage, and we're still trying to test to gather more evidence for it. But if you look at the pattern with which the North Korean regime went after these ransomware schemes, essentially ahead of time stealing a particular type of cryptocurrency, then conducting these ransomware adventures from a North Korean perspective, and then demanding the ransom be paid in the cryptocurrency that they had stolen before, leads to a demand-supply type of relationship with the stolen cryptocurrency increasing in value as more and more of these victims are trying to secure this cryptocurrency in different types of marketplaces. So this ransomware scheme is unique in that the value of what they've stolen can increase, and they have agency in making that value increase. And so I do think we're going to see innovation in this space. The second thing I mentioned is, early on you see ransomware against some big companies, big entities, but the trend line is to go after smaller businesses and individuals. And it's not a function of trying to get one target, one large payoff. It's to affect a system-wide demand of a particular cryptocurrency. And so if they can increase the number of individuals on a smaller amount, but in the millions of individuals and millions of victims, this is a type of demand signal that they can orchestrate and fabricate that has proven to be lucrative. So we continue to try to connect the dots here, but that is a working hypothesis that we currently have.
Thank you very much, John. Ethan, anything to add to that at all?
I wish I did, but I don't think it'd be nearly as eloquent or insightful as Dr. Mark, unfortunately.
Not to worry. I appreciate there's a lot of questions around the whole crypto side. I suppose a question from myself really, and then it sort of came to me through some of the things that I was reading as well. We know it's North Korea is a closed country. So as you alluded to earlier, Ethan, trying to get information or data out of the country is very, very difficult. But if we've got a reasonable understanding of what the issues are, or some of the issues anyway, is there more that could be done on the global stage to try and counter the threat, do you think? Is there things that we should be doing that we're currently not? Or have we exhausted every possible avenue that we can at present?
Do you mean counter the threat of North Korea generally, or the threat of North Korea?
In particular, in relation to obviously this event is focused on organised crime emanating from North Korea. So we'll keep it focused on that, please.
Right.
Ethan.
Yeah, I think that there are things that can be done, and a good place to start is probably a lot of the recommendations that you see coming out of the United Nations panel of experts reports. Every year or twice a year, they submit a report with all their findings. And at the very end, there's a long list of recommendations. Many of them are very good and well thought through. So just to take one example, if you wanted to make it harder for criminals to just simply turn off their AIS, for example, and sail around in the dark for a while, you can add clauses into contracts that essentially say, we won't accept cargo unless you can prove that your AIS transponder has been on the entire time, and you can prove your entire shipment, or you basically report your entire voyage minute by minute. So that's a good recommendation, and it's like, I forget the exact name for what that's called, but that technique is already used in some areas, but it would be good if that was more common, especially for traders based out of Singapore, where a lot of the oil networks are centered, as well as in Taiwan. So there's a lot of things that can be done. Unfortunately, there's a lot of issue of political will here. Obviously, the UN panel of experts recommending these things is one obstacle in and of itself, but actually getting it to be done is quite another. So unfortunately, I'm a little bit pessimistic that no matter what good ideas we might have, getting some sort of coordinated international response nowadays is seeming less and less likely. So on that somber note, I'll end it there.
Well, I'll echo that, Ethan. I think I've worked in some countries where we have very good law enforcement cooperation, and organised crime is still very difficult to counter. So I totally understand and don't underestimate the scale of the issue. John, your answer, please.
Nothing to add. Great points.
No, okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, a few more questions are coming in now, and so we've got about 10 minutes left to go. So, question here from Dick Rogers: how does the scale of income from North Korea from illicit activity compare with more conventional activity, for example, logging in Siberia and civil engineering? Would either of you two like to answer that question?
Sure. Ethan, would you like to go ahead, please?
Go ahead,
John,
sorry.
to you, I think.
Sure, I'll briefly kick it off there. Those have been traditional types of overseas labor revenue generation schemes, and we've heard, essentially the folks working in the timber industry and the Russian Far East. Then we heard of factory workers in Mongolia. The connection with a local North Korean consulate or embassy, essentially receiving the money from the factory or from the timber company, and essentially processing it, quote unquote, on behalf of the workers. But anecdotally, we've heard how the exploitation happens, and a small fraction goes to the worker's family. that I think is a type of activity that is increasingly going to be outpaced in terms of these other technology enabled. If you look at it from the Kim family aspect, I think it's uncanny how there are parallels. With Asian family wealth, it's usually the third generation that wants to do something dynamic, something different from the traditional family's source of the fortune. In this case, Kim Jong-un, when he showed up on the scene, he put a lot of focus on cyber capabilities. This is something that began under his father's watch, but in terms of allocation of resources, focus on deploying IT workers for revenue generation, overseas revenue generation from their labor, but also having the IT workers moonlight. Recently, the Department of Justice made a statement, issued essentially the whole warning that hiring an IT worker comes with this dual aspect of you potentially hiring a North Korean cyber actor as well. And so I do think this broader trend is going to continue. And with the technology side of things, there also was the increasing domestic sales of smartphones, other types of technology gadgets that the regime was trying to make money off of. So this is an area that I think is going to be more of a priority for the regime as these other overseas revenue from labor continue. But this is the technology business line that I think Kim Jong-un through North Korean corporate is going to double and triple down going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Ethan, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to point out, North Korea, or the UN passed a resolution several years ago that required countries to repatriate North Korean laborers. And as soon as North Korea's self-imposed COVID-19 quarantine is over, or rather border closure is over, there will be less excuses for keeping them, say, in Russia, logging in Siberia, or working as IT workers in China or the Middle East, or wherever they happen to be, or medical workers in Africa. And at that point, just by necessity, once these people actually start being repatriated, yeah, you're going to see the revenue from illicit activity naturally eclipse that of licit activity. So just something that we can expect to happen in the next several years, I think.
Thank you very much. Question here from Bianca asks whether there's any favorite jurisdictions that North Korea uses for money laundering purposes. And the second part to her question is, what are the chances of North Korean nationals being held accountable in foreign jurisdictions?
I can take a stab at that second question. The odds of North Korean nationals being held to account in foreign jurisdictions is unfortunately very low. I can say that we've only got currently one North Korean national in American custody, at least for breaking American sanctions, U.S. unilateral sanctions, and that's Moon Chol-myung. I believe he was caught up in essentially some sort of sugar overseas front company, but he was deported from, or rather extradited from Malaysia to the United States back in 2019. His trial has been delayed many, many times and has finally come to a head recently. He's going to plead guilty. But if we want to talk about, people being held accountable, if it takes 3 years just to prosecute a single person and they essentially get a plea deal at the end of it, I think that you can say that the chances of North Korean nationals being held account for this type of thing is very low, especially considering the scope of these activities. So another dose of pessimism for me, unfortunately, but I'm not very optimistic on that front.
Is there, so before I come to you, John, is there any suggestion that they are held accountable in North Korea once repatriated, or not, or are they celebrated as heroes, or what's the case?
I wish I had some sort of extra information to answer that accurately.
Okay.
But so I don't want to speculate too much.
Okay, not to worry. John.
Keith, I think they have a ceremony and they retire their jerseys. There's some sort of hall of fame, I would imagine, in North Korea for some of these more prolific actors. But all kidding aside, I do think the point that Ethan mentioned, the sovereignty, with jurisdiction is sovereignty. If you look at the large swath of migration of North Korean illicit activity into the Chinese marketplace, and the caveat here is it's not all illicit. In some instances, it's benign commercial activity. But once you build those commercial channels in itself becomes a dual-use technology in the sense it can be used to procure and bring back illicit items into North Korea. But here, when you try to go after some of these North Korean entities and some of these local Chinese counterparts, you hit the Great Wall of Sovereignty. The Chinese do not recognize these US sanctions in terms of implementing foreign laws in their jurisdiction. The Chinese authorities have been very consistent in stating that they support and adhere to UN Security Council resolutions. There's doubt and a lot of question marks about the extent to which they implement them. But the other element here is when you look at the activities that the North Koreans are doing with local partners, previously there were instances of interesting cooperation between Chinese and US authorities, but this predated the application of US tariffs and then Chinese tariffs in return on the United States. And the economic statecraft in the hierarchy, you have tariffs at the top, then you have economic sanctions way down on the list. And so if you're trying to get cooperation on sanctions implementation in an atmosphere where we have tariffs being applied by both countries on each other, and then the broader US effort to decouple certain technology components of the Chinese economy from the global economy, I think we really have to manage our expectations of seeing any type of cooperation on sanctions anytime soon.
Comment. Thank you very much, John. We are nearing the end. I'm going to squeeze in one question, but ask you both to restrict your answer to about 10 seconds. But when you hear the question, hopefully you'll realize that's not an unreasonable ask. So Alex asked the question, what books or papers would you recommend reading to understand more about North Korea? If I come to you first, Ethan, please.
Sure. My totally unbiased answer would be NK News and NK Pro. But after that, I would say The Impossible State by Dr. Cha is always a great place to start. It's essentially North Korea 101 reading, I would say. Also, if you're interested in things like organized crime and you can stomach long reports, the work that C4ADS and of course RUSI puts out is always fantastic. RUSI's Project Sandstone is doing regular updates on North Korea's oil smuggling networks. So if you want more insight on like the granular nature of the way these things go, that's a good place to start.
Thank you, John.
I would wholeheartedly second that. All the organizations that Ethan mentioned are phenomenal in regularly providing insights. It's not a one-hit wonder type of thing. And that process and the rigor with which the research is conducted continue to provide those insights. I would just very quickly add, as I mentioned earlier, my colleague Alex O'Neill's report, Cyber Criminal Statecraft. It's a phenomenal report in terms of how he's looked at it from the Russian criminal organization angle and then looking at some of the patterns with North Korean cyber actors. Very quickly, it was a report that was mentioned in a White House press conference. And Jake Sullivan basically just acknowledged, the key findings from the report as the journalist posed the question to Jake. So it's something that is at the forefront of policymakers' minds as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that is time almost about to run out. So before we get booted out of this virtual session, can I first of all thank both of you for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise on North Korea. I've learned a lot this afternoon, and I'm sure our participants have too. So thank you once again, and thank you once again to Uni Korea Foundation for the sponsorship of this event. I'd also like to thank very much the participants, not only those that asked questions, but the others that were present as well. Perhaps didn't ask a question, but hopefully they too have also learned a lot more from hearing both of you speak today. So thank you again. It's really great that you could join us and hear from our two experts. And lastly, thanks to my colleagues in RUSI for helping organise this event and inviting me to chair the event. As I say, North Korea is not a country I've worked on. I was about to say in, but I think that would be very difficult anyway, but worked on in the past, but certainly whetted my appetite to learn more. And I've made a note of a few of the things that you've recommended to read, etc. as well. So thank you very much, both of you again, John and Ethan, for your time and for your expertise. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I wish you a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.